She was so beautiful that the whole village turned to look. But why did every man who came near her leave bruised and scared? Have you ever met someone whose charming exterior hid a storm inside? Today's story will make you think about strength, vulnerability, and the journey of healing from buried pain. More than a folktale, it's a profound lesson in understanding instead of judging, listening instead of imposing. And you'll find that, sometimes, the person the whole village fears is the one with the most broken heart. Join me as we enter the village of Abaka, where one woman's story changed the entire community, once and for all. They say beauty can charm a village, but what if that beauty hides a storm? In the quiet village of Abaka, where whispers traveled faster than the wind, one name stirred both awe and fear: Oluchukwu. She was a girl of extraordinary beauty, so radiant that passers-by would stop mid-step, mouths slightly agape, enchanted by the smooth glow of her skin, the sparkle in her almond eyes, and the calm grace in her movements. Her beauty was the kind that made hearts pause, but behind that flawless exterior lived a storm, one no one dared to approach. You see, while the women of the village smiled easily and welcomed conversation, Oluchukwu did not. Her lips rarely curled into a smile, her eyes didn't soften, and if a man so much as stepped too close, the consequences were immediate and brutal. She wasn't like the other girls. She didn't laugh at flattery or blush at attention. She didn't giggle at compliments or entertain suitors. There was no warmth in her presence, only a cold steel that made even the bravest men hesitate. And if someone made the mistake of approaching her with romantic intentions, they'd likely leave with more than a broken heart, sometimes a black eye or a busted lip. Her fists spoke louder than any warning ever could. Rumor had it that some men couldn't stand for days after confronting her. Bruised egos weren't the only things left behind. The strange part, despite the growing number of injuries and humiliations among the male population, more and more men found themselves drawn to her. Maybe it was her mysterious silence, or the confidence with which she moved through crowds. Maybe it was because she didn't seek attention like everyone else, which somehow made her even more captivating. But one thing was clear: Oluchukwu didn't want love, didn't want company, and absolutely did not want to be touched. And the more the men pursued her, the more their fear grew. Fear of rejection, fear of shame, fear of pain. Villagers began to whisper warnings. "She is not like the others," they'd say. "Stay away." Her name, once said with admiration, became a soft-spoken warning passed between lips in hushed tones. Oluchukwu had become a living legend, a beauty with fists of fury. And yet, she lived among them, shopping in the same markets, walking the same roads, fetching water from the same stream. But her path was never crossed without caution. Children were told not to bother her, women kept their distance. Men, once eager to impress, now eyed her warily from afar. But no one truly understood the fire behind those bold eyes, or the storm that brewed within her silence. Was it anger? Was it madness? Or was it something far deeper, something rooted in pain? They didn't know. They never asked. All they saw was the girl who walked alone and dared anyone to step into her world. And in the village of Abaka, where beauty was often mistaken for fragility, Oluchukwu was a silent force of nature, untouched, unbroken, and absolutely unforgettable. She didn't say a word, but one slap silenced an entire market. It was a bright morning in the village of Abaka, and the market was alive with chatter. Merchants called out their prices, children darted between stalls, and the aroma of spices, roasted plantains, and fresh fish filled the air. Amid this bustle moved Oluchukwu, silent, poised, untouchable. Her presence sent ripples through the crowd. She didn't greet anyone, didn't smile, and her eyes gave nothing away. She moved like the wind, seen but not touched. People parted as she walked, careful not to get too close. Everyone in the village knew her reputation, and no one wanted to risk it. But that day, something changed. A young man, distracted by his bargaining, stepped backward into Oluchuku's path. He wasn't trying to be disrespectful. He didn't even see her. But in an instant, everything stopped. Without a single word, Oluchuku's hand rose like lightning. Slap! The sound echoed across the market square like thunder on a clear day. The boy stumbled back, eyes wide with disbelief and pain, clutching his face as red bloomed across his cheek. A hush fell over the crowd. The merchants stopped calling. The children stopped laughing. Even the goats stopped bleating. For a moment, the world held its breath. And then came the whispers. She did it again. Another one slapped. She doesn't even hesitate. The boy, humiliated and stunned, didn't retaliate. He bowed his head in fear and offered a string of trembling apologies before turning and vanishing into the crowd. Oluchuku, unfazed, didn't offer a word. She adjusted her basket, picked up her vegetables, and walked away as if nothing had happened. But something had. Something shifted that day. The fear that already surrounded her had grown thicker, like smoke in the air. And it clung to everyone. The women in the market exchanged glances but said nothing. They knew better. No one dared confront her. No one questioned her anger. No one asked why she reacted so violently to even the smallest offense. They just watched, memorized her movements, and reminded themselves to stay out of her way. The children began to include her in their nighttime stories, ghost tales of the fierce woman with the blazing eyes and thunder hands. Men grew even more cautious, avoiding eye contact and steering their carts far away. Oluchuku had always been a mystery, but now she was something more, a force to be feared, a legend being written in real time. And yet, beneath that public fear was something deeper, fascination. People wondered, what made her like this? Why would a girl so beautiful carry herself with such sharp edges, such unchecked rage? No one dared to ask, but everyone wanted to know. The market, once just a place of trade, had become the latest stage for her legend. And with every whispered rumor and retelling of that slap, Oluchuku's name grew heavier, a name no man wanted to test, and no villager would ever forget. They thought her heart could be won with gifts and sweet words, until they left her doorstep bleeding. In most villages, when a man falls for a woman, he brings flowers, offers kind words, and hopes to win her affection. But in Abaka, no such strategy worked when it came to Oluchuku. Her name alone sent shivers down spines, yet her beauty drew them in like moths to flame. Men, though warned time and again, believed they might be the exception. They whispered to themselves, maybe if I'm gentle, maybe she'll soften for me. But no one truly understood that Oluchuku didn't need soft. She didn't want it, and she certainly didn't trust it. The parade of suitors became a spectacle all its own. Young farmers with baskets of fruit, merchants offering gold trinkets, and sons of noblemen dressed in fine robes, all came to her door with hopeful smiles and trembling hearts, and all left battered, bruised, and humiliated. She didn't mince words. She didn't give warnings. If a man crossed a boundary, spoke too sweetly, stood too close, dared to lay a hand on her arm, she struck without hesitation. One man left her hut with a deep cut on his lip, his once white tunic stained crimson. Another stumbled out with both eyes swollen shut, barely able to walk straight. And yet the stories only seemed to feed the curiosity of the next fool in line. She just needs the right man, they said. She's not angry. She's misunderstood. But Oluchuku saw through every mask, every charming smile. She had met too many men who wore kindness like a disguise. The worst humiliation came when the village chief himself sent his son, a proud young man with an ego as large as the palace. She won't dare touch my son, the chief boasted. He's royalty. The villagers held their breath, curious to see if the chief's son would succeed where others had failed. He showed up at Oluchuku's home draped in silk, wearing the smug confidence of someone who had never been told no. He bowed low. presented rare jewels, and spoke like a rehearsed poet. Oluchuku didn't say a word, and when he tried to touch her hand, thinking his high status gave him permission, she punched him so hard that two of his teeth flew across the room. He staggered out, blood pouring from his mouth, and collapsed in the dirt outside her home. The chief was furious, but even he knew better than to challenge Oluchuku. His son's status hadn't protected him, and neither would anyone else's. Word of her rejections and her fists spread beyond Abaka's borders. Other villages heard about the beautiful, terrifying woman who beat down any man who dared to think they could tame her. The men of Abaka learned the hard way that Oluchuku wasn't a prize to be won. She was a warning carved in flesh and bone. But even as bruises faded and bones healed, the question lingered. What made her this way? No one knew. But with each failed suitor, each swollen face and broken pride, the mystery and the fear only grew. The whole village waited for her answer, but what she gave them was silence sharper than any scream. As Oluchuku's legend grew, so did the confusion, fear, and curiosity that surrounded her. Men avoided her path, women whispered behind her back, and children told tales of her fury like bedtime warnings. But the question no one could answer still hung heavy over the village of Abaka. Why did she hate men so much? Her rage was unmatched, her boundaries untouchable, and her fists swift and merciless. Even the bravest suitors had limped away from her home. Some said it was madness, others believed it was pride. But a few began to wonder if it was something more, a wound no one could see. Eventually, the elders could no longer sit in silence. This wasn't just a girl with a temper. This was a storm threatening the balance of the village. So they gathered in the village square and sent for her. The entire community came to watch, from the curious children clinging to their mothers' skirts to the old men leaning heavily on their walking sticks. Everyone wanted to hear what Oluchuku had to say, if she would speak at all. When she arrived, she walked with the same unshaken grace that had haunted their stories, head high, shoulders squared, eyes scanning the crowd, not with arrogance, but with unwavering strength. She wasn't afraid. She never was. And that frightened them more than anything else. She stood before the circle of elders, her hands calmly at her sides, waiting. Oluchuku, one elder began, his voice low but firm. Why do you fight the men of this village? Another followed. Why do you beat every suitor who comes your way? The crowd held its breath, expecting a blast of emotion or a long-awaited confession. But Oluchuku didn't raise her voice. She didn't even raise her eyebrows. She simply looked the elders in the eyes and said, clear and cold as riverstone, I will never let a man control me, and I will never stop beating them. Gasps fluttered through the air like startled birds. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Men shuffled in discomfort. The elders were stunned. They had expected resistance, perhaps anger, but not such blunt, unapologetic defiance. They pushed further, trying to understand. But why, child? What made you this way? What happened to you? Silence. Oluchuku didn't answer. She didn't cry, didn't tremble, didn't blink. Her silence was louder than the drums that marked war, sharper than the knives used at harvest. She looked at them all, men, women, children, and gave them nothing. No excuse, no explanation. Only a wall that no one had the tools to climb. The elders, defeated and bewildered, had no choice but to dismiss her. She turned and walked away, and the crowd parted like reeds in her wake. Behind her, the whispers started again. But this time, there was something new in them, not just fear, but hunger for the truth. What secret could harden a heart so young? What pain could sharpen silence into a weapon? They didn't know it yet, but Oluchuku's silence was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of something far deeper, something about to break free from the shadows. He reached out to help her. But one punch later, he became her next cautionary tale. It was a blazing afternoon in Abaka, and the sun poured over the fields like molten gold. Oluchuku had gone to the stream that day, her clay pot balanced with practiced grace atop her head. The path was rough, worn by time and rain, but she walked it alone, as always. After filling her pot with water, she began her return. But then, as fate would have it, her foot slipped on a jagged stone, and she tumbled forward. The pot crashed to the ground, shattering into pieces. Water splashed onto the dirt. Her ankle twisted, and pain surged through her leg. She sat there for a moment, gritting her teeth against the sting, trying to push herself upright. That's when a man, a local farmer passing by, rushed over. He had seen her fall from the edge of the field and didn't hesitate. Without a word, he bent down and gently reached for her injured foot, trying to assess the bleeding and help her stand. But to Oluchuku, that outstretched hand didn't look like kindness. It looked like a threat. It looked like control. Her body reacted before her mind could catch up. Her fist flew through the air. Bam! It landed squarely on the farmer's face, knocking him backward into the dust. The man groaned, holding his cheek, utterly stunned. "I was just trying to help," he gasped, his voice trembling more from confusion than pain. But Oluchuku's eyes were ablaze. "Don't you dare touch me," she snapped, her voice cutting through the silence around them like a blade. The farmer staggered to his feet, still reeling from the blow. He didn't fight back. In Abaka, no man dared strike a woman, especially not this woman. He limped away slowly, shame burning brighter than the mark on his cheek. Word spread like wildfire. She beat a man who was only trying to help her, they whispered. The tale rippled through the village by nightfall, passed from house to house like a ghost story. The market women shook their heads. The elders sighed. The children asked if it was true. And the men, those who still entertained fantasies of changing Oluchuku, fell silent. If even a gesture of kindness could earn a fist to the face, then what hope did any man have? That one moment at the stream deepened the legend. Oluchuku wasn't just fierce. She was unpredictable, untouchable, unreachable. The villagers no longer tried to understand her. They only tried to avoid her. She had become a symbol, not a person. A warning, not a woman. But the truth, as always, was more complex. Oluchuku hadn't seen a kind stranger that day. She had seen her past. She had seen every cruel hand disguised as help, every man who had ever pretended to care, only to take advantage. Her reaction wasn't just rage, it was protection, reflex, survival. The villagers didn't know that. They only saw the slap. They only heard the silence. And so, Oluchuku's shadow grew longer, darker, and still, no one asked why her walls were built so high. In the heart of Abaka, Oluchuku had become both a myth and a warning. No man had succeeded in taming her spirit, and most had learned to stay far out of reach. But one man, wrapped in silk and certainty, believed he was different. He was the prince, heir to the village throne, raised to believe that no door would ever close to him, no heart could deny him. And when he first laid eyes on Oluchuku, he didn't see a threat. He saw a challenge. Her strength intrigued him. Her independence stirred something unfamiliar: admiration. While others feared her, he saw someone who had never bowed to power. So, he decided to win her over. Day after day, he arrived at her home with gifts: sweet fruits, rare fabrics, golden earrings, and beaded bracelets that sparkled in the sun. To everyone's shock, Oluchuku didn't slam the door in his face. She didn't push him away. She accepted the gifts with a cool nod, though her eyes never softened. The villagers watched from afar, whispering in disbelief. Is she letting him in? Has the prince found her weakness? Maybe love really can change her. But love was not what Oluchuku felt. She was wary, her senses sharpened like a blade. She watched every movement he made, every smile he offered. She was waiting, not for romance, but for the moment he would cross a line, because they always did. One afternoon, the prince invited her on a walk by the stream. The air was cool, and the sound of water filled the silence between them. He smiled as they strolled side by side, thinking, "She hasn't pushed me away. Maybe she's warming up." Encouraged by the quiet, by the absence of violence, he reached for her hand. Just a simple gesture, just fingers brushing hers. But in Oluchuku's mind, it was more than that. It was possession, presumption, power, and she had learned through years of pain to strike before being struck. Before he could say a word, her fist crashed into his chest. Bam! He staggered back, but she wasn't done. Another blow snapped his head sideways. Pow! The prince, strong as he was no match for her fury. She unleashed the pain she had buried deep inside, every punch a shield forged from memories of betrayal and violence. When he finally collapsed, battered and bleeding, his guards rushed in. They lifted his broken body and carried him back to the palace. The entire village gasped in horror. She beat the prince, the son of the king? No one had dared raise a hand against him before. But Oluchuku wasn't like anyone they had ever known. News spread like wildfire, from the market stalls to the royal court. The king's fury boiled over, demanding answers, demanding punishment. But Oluchuku stood firm, her head high, her eyes unrepentant. The prince had made a mistake, and he paid the price. And as the village reeled in disbelief, one truth settled in their hearts like a storm cloud. If even royalty could be broken by her fists, then no man was safe from the fire that burned behind Oluchuku's eyes. They thought she was just angry, until her silence broke into a story that shattered the village. When Oluchuku stood before the king in the palace courtyard, bruised from battle yet unbending in her spirit, the villagers watched with bated breath. For years, she had been the girl no one dared to question, the woman no man could conquer. Now, she faced the wrath of a furious king after attacking his son, the prince himself. The courtyard buzzed with tension. Would she finally break? Would she finally explain why she struck fear into the hearts of men with every step she took? The king roared from his throne, demanding an answer. "Why did you hurt my son?" he shouted. "Speak now, or face the consequences." But Oluchuku said nothing. Her silence, as it always had, cut deeper than any scream. The villagers leaned forward, eyes wide, hearts racing. Everyone wanted to hear the story that had never been told. And then, something changed. Her shoulders dropped, her chin trembled, her hardened eyes, so used to burning with fire, softened. A hush fell over the crowd, and for the first time, Oluchuku began to speak. "My father," she said slowly, "was the man who was supposed to protect us. But he didn't." Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. "He beat my mother every single day. He treated her like nothing. And when she tried to speak, he'd raise his hand, and she'd go quiet, too afraid to fight back." The villagers were stunned. Children stopped fidgeting. The king's glare faded into stillness. "One day," she continued, "my mother was pregnant. They argued. It was small. So small. But he lost control. He beat her so badly that she lost the baby." Gasps rippled through the courtyard. "And then," Oluchuku whispered, "she died." The silence that followed was heavier than stone. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the king, once ready to punish her, sat frozen on his throne. "I was just a child," she said, tears spilling freely now. "I watched her die. I couldn't save her, and after my father died not long after, I thought I'd be safe." She looked up, eyes blazing again, not with rage this time, but with pain. "But I wasn't." Oluchoku explained how she was sent to live with her uncles, men just like her father. Men who dragged women into their home and treated them like property. Men who beat their wives, silenced their voices, and ruled their households with fists instead of love. She had witnessed every blow, every scream, every tear, and all of it carved something permanent into her soul. "I made a promise," she said firmly, wiping her cheeks. "No man would ever lay a hand on me. No man would ever control me. Not again." And just like that, the myth of Oluchukwu unraveled, and a human story emerged from the ashes. The villagers, once afraid of her strength, now stood in awe of her survival. They hadn't seen a monster. They had seen a warrior forged by tragedy. The men bowed their heads. The women wiped their eyes. And in that moment, Oluchukwu stopped being a warning and became a voice for every woman who had suffered in silence. They once feared her fury. Now they honored her fire. When Oluchukwu's story spilled into the open like water breaking through a dam, the village of Abaka stood stunned, speechless. Her silence had always seemed threatening, her fists unforgiving, her presence a storm to avoid. But now they saw it differently. Behind every blow was not hatred, but history. Behind her strength was a graveyard of memories she had been forced to carry alone. And as the truth settled over the village like dusk over the fields, something began to shift. The men who had once tried to tame her now hung their heads in shame. Many of them had once laughed at her anger, dismissed her pain, or thought her strength was unnatural for a woman. Now they understood. Her hands had been weapons because no one had ever defended her. Her rage had been armor because no one else had offered her shelter. The villagers realized what they had never bothered to ask. What had she been protecting herself from all this time? And among those who finally saw her in a new light stood the prince. Once arrogant, entitled, and convinced that charm could conquer all, he now stood humbled. The bruises on his face had faded, but the lesson remained deep. He returned to Oluchukwu, not with gifts, not with promises, but with an apology, not one born of fear, but of respect. He knelt before her, in front of the same villagers who had once cheered his status and whispered her name like a curse. "I thought I understood strength," he said, his voice steady. "But I was wrong. Yours is a strength that comes from pain and survival. I was foolish to try and win you like a prize. I see you now, and I'm sorry." The entire village watched in silence as Oluchukwu studied him. She didn't smile, she didn't cry, but she extended her hand, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. This time, the touch didn't burn. It didn't control. It simply connected. The king, moved by the honesty in his son's voice and the depth of Oluchukwu's truth, stood before the people and made a declaration that would change Abaka forever. "From this day forward," he announced, "no man shall harm or silence a woman without facing the full judgment of this land. The pain one woman carried alone for years must never be repeated." And with those words, Abaka began to heal. The uncles who had brutalized women for years were brought to justice. The wives who had lived in silence were heard, perhaps for the first time. Conversations that were once whispered behind closed doors now took place in public, openly, bravely. Women no longer walked the village with downcast eyes. They looked ahead, shoulders back, steps firm. And Oluchukwu, the woman they once feared, became a symbol of courage. She agreed to marry the prince, not because he tamed her, but because he honored her. Their union wasn't a fairy tale, it was a testament to growth, to redemption, to the fact that real love begins where power ends and respect begins. In the heart of Abaka, a new story was born, not just of survival, but of transformation. And Oluchukwu's name, once whispered in fear, was now spoken with reverence. She was once a tale of warning. Now she's a story of strength passed from one generation to the next. Years passed in the village of Abaka, but the story of Oluchukwu never faded. It was no longer told in fearful whispers or with wide-eyed caution. It was told by firelight, in classrooms, under mango trees where children gathered to listen. Her name, once associated with flying fists and bruised pride, now stood for something greater: resilience, justice, and healing. What began as fear had transformed into legacy. Parents now used her story to teach, not about fear of women, but about the strength that comes from surviving pain, the importance of listening, and the danger of ignoring silence. Oluchukwu was never just angry, they'd say. She was brave enough to break the silence when no one else could. The women in the village, many of whom had once hidden their bruises or swallowed their pain, now walked with newfound dignity. They held their heads higher, spoke their minds, and supported one another in ways that had never been seen before. They saw in Oluchukwu not just a survivor, but a sister, a protector, a symbol that their voices mattered. And the men, they had changed too. No longer raised to believe that strength meant dominance, they were taught a new definition of power: the power to protect, to respect, to understand. Even the prince, now king, led by a different example. His marriage to Oluchukwu stood not as proof of conquest, but as a union of equals. He often reminded his people, "It is not strength to silence a voice, it is strength to listen and still stand by it." Oluchukwu herself never became soft, nor was she expected to. Her strength was her grace, her fire, a beacon. Though the scars of her past would never disappear, she carried them not with shame, but with pride. She continued to walk the same paths, fetch water from the same stream, pass through the same market. But the way people looked at her had changed, no longer with fear, but with reverence. Children would approach her, eyes wide with admiration, asking questions about her story. And sometimes, if the moment felt right, she would tell them, not every painful detail, but enough to help them understand one truth: that silence is not weakness, and survival is not shame. Abaka became known beyond its borders, not for its crops or crafts, but for its transformation. Other villages sent visitors to learn how they had changed, and every time someone would point to Oluchukwu, now a woman of few words, still steady as stone, and say, "It started with her." The legend of Oluchukwu, once heavy with misunderstanding, became light with meaning. Her journey from brokenness to boldness inspired not just one village, but generations. She had protected herself when no one else would. She had spoken truth when silence was safer. She had turned pain into power, not to destroy, but to rebuild. And in that transformation, Oluchukwu became more than a name. She became a story etched into the soul of Abaka, a tale of what happens when one woman's strength dares to rewrite the fate of an entire village. Life teaches us that strength isn't always loud, and pain isn't always visible. Through Oluchukwu's story, we're reminded that those who seem the hardest on the outside may be carrying the deepest wounds within. Her fierce spirit wasn't born from hatred, but from heartbreak, from witnessing injustice, from surviving cruelty, from a life where silence once meant suffering. For older generations who have lived through loss, betrayal, or sacrifice, this tale holds a gentle truth. Protecting your peace is not weakness, it is wisdom. It also reminds us that no matter how broken the past, healing can begin the moment we are seen and heard with compassion. In a world quick to judge and slow to understand, may we learn to look beyond the surface, at our neighbors, our children, even ourselves. Let us listen with empathy, speak with courage, and love with respect. Because real strength is not in the fists we raise, but in the hearts we open, after they've been hurt and still choose to heal. And sometimes, the most powerful change begins with one person brave enough to say, "No more."